The story of the Beatles deserves a longer form vehicle to authentically explore the world they created. I would love to see something more like a 3-part movie series, or even a high-budget mini-series. Something that is missing from pretty much all of these movies is a thorough depiction of their creative process. I know I'm probably asking for a lot.
Well, I guess I got my wish. Hello everyone. After months of delays, format changes, massive anticipation, The Beatles Get Back has finally been released. Hopefully you've seen it all at this point, and if you haven't, go and watch it now because I'll be discussing, I guess you could call them spoilers, a lot of newly revealed information in this video. I also appreciate your patience on this one. I think YouTube is a very reactive place, and I didn't want to just do like a messy reaction video because this film means a lot to me, and I just needed a bit of extra time to properly articulate and edit my thoughts on this one, so thank you. I would have been able to get this out earlier, but I'm still working a part-time job which takes up half my time. So if you'd like to help me move towards my goal of quitting my job and making videos full-time, please consider supporting me on Patreon. You'll not only help me move towards my goal, but you'll also get a bunch of great bonus content as well. So check it out, link in the description. Now, before I begin on the series, I should mention that I was lucky enough to attend a screening of the 100-minute version that's been shown as a kind of premiere in various cities around the world, including the one Paul McCartney attended. My friend and film reviewer Daniel Lemon was kind enough to invite me along as his +1, and I was absolutely delighted to be able to witness this amazing event before the rest of the world. By the way, go and check out Daniel's podcast Ink and Paint, a journey through Disney's animated classics. If you're into animation, I think you'll really dig it. Now, before I give my full thoughts on the 3-part series, I figured you might be interested to know exactly what was in the 100-minute version. So upon arrival, there was Beatles music playing in the lobby, we took some awkward photos, and then once the lights went down in the cinema, we get a Peter Jackson home movie from 2003, which alludes to his love of the Beatles. Right after that, Peter Jackson greets us on screen to introduce the film. He briefly gave context as to where the Beatles are up to in their career at this point, much like the 3-part series, but instead of a tightly edited montage, it's just Peter Jackson summing it up for us. He spoke about the original Let It Be and how it's a 16mm film poorly blown up to 35mm, sacrificing the quality in the process, and also mentioned how the original sound is in an underwhelming mono. He played a clip on screen of the original Let It Be film that then transformed into the crystal clear quality of Peter Jackson's version, so it went from dull, dark and grainy to vibrant, bright and clear, and there was this audible gasp from the audience, which was really cool. He also discussed the way that the sound was improved through machine learning. He showed the scene with lots of chatter and background noise, and you can see George Harrison kind of in the distance trying to say something completely inaudible. But then he plays it again with the machine learning edit, and you can hear every word George is saying whilst keeping the atmosphere of the background intact. He then showed this clip of a band rehearsal with everyone on their instruments, and there's, sound bleeding into all the mics, but then managed to show us how they were able to teach an algorithm essentially what a guitar sounds like, and they isolated the guitar, they isolated the drums, the bass, the voices, and it was just incredible to watch. Like, this is clearly not technology that would have been available even 5 years ago. Then he finally introduced us to what we'd be seeing in this 100-minute version. Out of the 22 days of filming in January 1969, this 100-minute version only showed 2 days from that month. January 27th, so day 18, and January 30th, day 22, aka the full rooftop performance. Jackson mentioned that he picked day 18 because they were now at Apple with Billy Preston, and they were finally able to get some productivity and goodwill in their songwriting and rehearsing. It's a good choice. And the decision behind including the full rooftop performance, well, that speaks for itself, I think. And just side note, seeing the full rooftop performance in a movie theater with like proper sound, holy shit, it was incredible. And finally, if you're wondering if there was anything in the 100-minute version that wasn't in the Disney Plus version, the answer is no. Unless you count all the clips of Peter Jackson discussing the film, but otherwise, if you've seen the series, you've seen it all. So now, the 3-part series. In my last video, I discussed my hopes for The Beatles Get Back, and if you missed that one, you can check it out right here. Now, there's quite a lot to unpack here, so in keeping with the theme, I'm going to split my thoughts up into 3 different parts with a conclusion at the end. Something I mentioned in my previous video is the incredible way Get Back looks. I've seen a few people mention that the smoothing on their faces is very distracting and looks quite strange, but I think that without it, you'd have just a ton of film grain and other imperfections that just wouldn't mesh with the high quality production value that the film is going for. I noticed it at the start, just every now and then when they do like a close-up, their eyebrows often look like brush strokes, but it's something I stopped noticing very quickly and was able to just marvel at how contemporary and modern it set looks. It feels like these shots could have been captured yesterday, which also makes their clothing choices even more charming and funny. Another thing I was looking forward to was the sheer length of the project. Initially, all we heard was that it was going to be a 3-part series totaling about 6 hours. What we got instead was a 3-part series that runs for a total of 7 hours, 48 minutes. Now, I've heard some people say, oh, it's too long, how am I meant to watch all this? Well, for someone like me, and I'm sure for many of you, I was happy for Peter Jackson to make it as long as he wanted, however long he needed to tell the story properly. And if we know anything about Peter Jackson, is that he tends to make long movies out of epic stories and quite famously turns them into trilogies. I actually loved the way it was paced out, but I realized that for someone who's maybe just a casual Beatles fan, the runtime may seem a little bit daunting. However, I don't think the total sum is too much. It's the way that it's split up that makes it feel really long. What do I mean by this? Well, let's compare the runtime to another show that was released this year that everyone seemed to binge in a matter of days, Netflix's Squid Game, where the entire first season is only 17 minutes longer than the total runtime of The Beatles Get Back. The difference is, Squid Game, like many other streaming shows, split up its content into 9 episodes, roughly an hour each in length, which makes it feel easier to accomplish. It's a format that people are now used to. This makes Get Back's trilogy format on a streaming platform a bit of an adjustment. But I see this as a positive of the current age we're living in, where a movie, TV show, documentary can be whatever it needs to be. And I think Peter Jackson turned these 56 hours of footage into what it needed to be. And trust me, if we only got 2 hours, or if we just got the 100-minute version, it would not be enough to tell this story properly. I think part of the genius of The Beatles Get Back is the story that Peter Jackson was able to assemble out of those 56 hours of footage. And as insufferable as he is in the film,
I'm a bigger fan than you are.
I must give credit to the original director Michael Lindsay Hogg, who was at times basically able to trick the Beatles into forgetting they were being filmed and recorded by doing things like applying tape over the red light on the cameras and have his crew pretend to take a break, all the while capturing absolute gold from the Beatles. But Michael Lindsay Hogg, whose outlandish ideas like having the Beatles play in some ancient amphitheater in Libya or an orphanage,
What about a hospital? But I don't mean for really sick kids. I mean for kids with broken legs.
never really gets his way on the project, and halfway through the series admits,
I don't know what story I'm telling anymore.
this of course resulted in the messy and dull Let It Be, which now more than ever just feels like bad quality clips of mostly pretty ordinary moments between the lads. Then Peter Jackson comes in half a century later and realizes that the Beatles have actually been telling the story all along. Meaning Get Back doesn't have contemporary interviews because we don't need them. God love the man, but we don't need someone like Dave Grohl interrupting the flow of the documentary to tell us why the Beatles are so important, because the Beatles are showing us that themselves. It truly is a unique experience that makes you feel like you're in the rehearsal room in 1969, and that's exactly what this film should be. Let's separate Get Back from its documentary leanings for a moment and look at it through the lens of narrative, plot, and story. In this case, the plot is simple. The Beatles must write and rehearse 14 new songs and perform them at the end of the process, with the added challenge of only having 2 weeks to accomplish this. The story of Get Back is of 4 musicians outgrowing their identity as a band and figuring out who they now are to each other and to themselves. John's off creating strange art with Yoko and preaching world peace. George is yearning to be credited as an artist in his own right and bring out an album of his own songs. Paul is about to become a family man, and Ringo is, well, he's about to star in a movie, I suppose. The point is, these boys are now men and are beginning to experience life as individuals and not as a foursome. And Get Back explores this dichotomy through their conversations, their actions, and of course through their music. The story is also split into 3 parts. The first part encompassing the early and most tension-driven rehearsals of their songs in the cold and unwelcoming Twickenham studios, resulting in George Harrison leaving the group by the end of part 1. Part 2 opens with the uncertainty of the Beatles even staying together as a band at all, but moves into happier territory once George returns, as well as moving into Apple Studios, along with the inclusion of additional member Billy Preston, lifting the spirits of everyone involved. Part 2 ends with the idea of them playing on the rooftop as a way to end with a big finish. Part 3 are the final rehearsals plus the famous rooftop performance played in full. Peter Jackson should really be commended for crafting a cohesive story out of all of these events, because it makes the whole experience a treat for our eyes and ears, and creates a satisfying narrative that I think people will find something new in with each consecutive watch. One One of the most amazing things about the Beatles Get Back is the sheer amount of new information presented to us. Like, I knew we'd get some never before seen footage, but watching Get Back was like revelation after revelation. One of the first things I noticed is how, apart from a key argument between George and Paul, all of the Beatles actually got on really well with each other for almost the entire time. None of them hurl abuse at each other or are even that impolite to each other. I realized this only a few minutes in when one of the first things we hear from George Harrison is a compliment towards Paul on his appearance.
I think your beard suits you, man.
It was only a small moment, but one that made me realize that all preconceptions about these guys can be thrown away. We're about to watch history rewritten. I didn't mention this in my Hopes for the Beatles Get Back video, but I did in my Beatles biopic video, and that is that I've always wanted to see an accurate portrait of the Beatles' creative process. And of all my favorite discoveries from Get Back, witnessing the creative process of the Beatles in real time has got to be the greatest gift of all in my opinion. The first obvious one is John and Paul working on the song Gimme Some Truth, which I always thought was a John song, but it appears that Paul contributes as well.
Remember your hangman bit?
No, freaked out, yellow-bellied son of Gary Cooper gonna...
Yeah.
I mean, even Paul didn't realize he did this.
And he's clearly co-written a song. The next time I see Paul, I say to him, I had no idea, Paul, that you co-wrote Give Me Some Truth. And he looks at me and says, what, Give Me Some Truth, you mean John's song from his solo album? I said, yeah. And he said, no, I didn't have anything to do with that. So I get my iPad and he looks at it and he shakes his head and he says, I have no memory of working on that song. And then he sort of had a twinkle in his eye and he says, oh, that's a really great song, so I'm happy to take a little bit of credit for it.
It is very cool to not only hear, but to see these solo 70s songs like Give Me Some Truth and All Things Must Pass worked out as Beatles tunes first. Speaking of All Things Must Pass, John suggesting that lyrical change from a wind can blow those clouds away to
A mind can blow those clouds away. It's like...
Yeah, okay.
which George just welcomes and totally utilizes.
Got a bit of psychedelia in it, you know.
These little contributions from them all are so lovely to see. Okay, wow, this was a huge one. Pretty much everyone has brought up this one, but I'm talking about the point where we're watching Paul come up with Get Back on the spot. The birth of a song out of nothing. He's just strumming his Hofner absent-mindedly, which I've helpfully recreated for you here. Then some indistinct vocals start to emerge while Ringo and George look on, half asleep by the looks of things. I was watching this on my TV and it dawned on me what was happening and I just shouted, "This is Get Back! We're watching Paul make Get Back!" Then George joins in on guitar, Ringo follows on drums. People have asked Paul McCartney for years, how do you come up with your songs? And here we have one born out of the ether in front of our very eyes. How Michael Lindsay Hogg kept this out of the original Let It Be is anyone's guess. I really feel like that guy had an axe to grind. Not only do we get to see the genesis of the song Get Back, but it's the song that we arguably witnessed the most of in every stage of its creation, which I think is pretty appropriate. It is the name of the film after all. Now, it's not all sunshine and revisionist history. There is a major cause of friction in the first part, which culminates in George Harrison leaving the group for a few days. The first sign we see of this is on day 3, where they're coming up with the harmonic arrangement for Don't Let Me Down. And George and Paul are bickering about it before John has to say,
Okay, girls. Give in. Right, I give in then on that.
Weirdly, John plays the role of mediator way more than I expected and is virtually never the cause of any of the arguments. He's not that embittered character he's often depicted as. In fact, when he's not joking around, he's more likely to be coming down from whatever stone night he'd been recovering from. But he's never a caustic presence. I suppose the tension with John happens a few months down the line when he unilaterally appoints Alan Klein as their new manager. Later in the film, we do see John mention that he's just met Alan Klein for the first time and how amazing he is, and it's a fairly sad sign of things to come.
Just like he knows me as much as you do. Credible guy.
But getting back to George, who still thinks Don't Let Me Down sounds awful. Paul tries to rally them all and says,
We're all at odds. We're doing that thing we did on the Beatles.
the White Album. And this is where the famous argument between George and Paul from Let It Be arrives.
Whatever it is that will please you, I'll do it.
But we now have a greater context for what is actually going on with the band, and we get right to the emotional core of the argument with a heartfelt declaration from Paul, who's getting close to breaking point and says,
I'm scared of being the boss, and I have been for like a couple of years.
Maybe it's just me, but Paul actually sounds a bit choked up when he's venting about how it's not his desire to be this controlling figure within the band.
Put you down and stop you playing, but I'm not. I'm trying to stop us all playing. until we...
You can hear how he doesn't want to be that cause of friction. He just wants them all to work together, but him getting them all to work together is the cause of friction. It's also really interesting to see Paul lose the room for a bit. Since about 1970, everyone who's ever been in Paul McCartney's presence has acted like it's a life-changing moment for them, and of course. But here he is in a room full of people who are nothing but fed up with him. The next day, while Michael Lindsay Hogg is hanging around, George Harrison mentions that
The Beatles have been in doldrums for at least a year. Ever since Mr. Epstein passed away, it's never been the same.
I think it's interesting they still call him Mr. Epstein even after he's died. Paul then tries to plead his case and says that there's no one really there now to say do it.
Daddy's gone away now, you know, and we're on our own at the holiday camp.
This all ends with George throwing the earliest wrench in the idea of the Beatles staying together with the line,
Maybe we should have a divorce.
so we've got George over here marinating on the idea of the Beatles breaking up. Meanwhile, we've got John and Paul working together eyeball to eyeball on Get Back. And I think this is where we see George really start to crack. How it must feel to be sat to the side while these other two are meshing together so beautifully. Because as Paul says in the film,
Musically, you know, we can play better than we've ever been able to play, you know.
he says he and John aren't seeing each other as much anymore, but they're playing together better than ever. And I think that's a really important distinction. And it doesn't help when George challenges Paul's ideas on his song and Paul just keeps shutting him down. What's becoming clear is that Paul is partly using these rehearsals as time to just be with John. He literally hasn't been able to see him, to just be able to hang out with his best friend, and these band rehearsals are kind of the only time that these two can just be mates and have a laugh. Meanwhile, George is here trying to contribute and Paul's just knocking him back at every turn.
Now I'm trying to sing louder to get over the guitar now.
John's not really taking his song seriously, Paul's severely limiting George's guitar.
See, but don't... If you vamp, then it takes away from his vamping.
Then Paul just walks over to John and starts working on the lyrics while again George is just in the corner fiddling with his guitar, probably thinking about the scores of musicians who would give anything to work with him. Then it switches to the rehearsal of Two of Us, where we see some really skillful editing where we've got John and Paul meshing together beautifully, literally singing a song called Two of Us to each other. I mean, who can blame George for feeling left out? And this is where we see, or I suppose hear, George quit the Beatles. Whether they actually had footage of George quitting is unclear, but the audio tells you everything you need to know.
I think I'll be leaving the band now.
When?
Now. Get a replacement.
And then he's gone, and John is pissed.
So pissed.
Then the three remaining Beatles get back together and just start wilding out. They're all obviously stressed, angry, and frustrated and start letting off some serious steam by playing heavily and messily. Yoko then gets on the mic and it just becomes a cacophony of sound. Paul starts swinging from the scaffolding, just letting it out however he can. Then we get some pretty telling information from their longtime producer, George Martin, who says that George Harrison really only has himself, whereas John and Paul are a team. Michael Lindsay Hogg asks George Martin,
But John and Paul aren't writing together much anymore, are they really?
and George Martin says, no, but nevertheless, they're still a team. And that is the crux of the issue here. Oh boy. I thought the decision to end part one with a demo of George Harrison's Isn't It a Pity was a perfect choice. A song that the Beatles had been rejecting from George ever since Revolver that finally turned up on All Things Must Pass. Although not written about the Beatles and more about society as a whole, in fact the song George actually did write on the day that he quit was Wah Wah. But Isn't It a Pity really suits the fractured mood and broken bond between the band at this point in time. I loved all those slow motion shots of everyone, I just thought it worked really well. And then there's that moment that the three remaining Beatles kind of come together in a huddle after George quits. I mean, that was an emotional one, folks. Then 2 days later, when the Beatles and their wives meet up with George and the words come up,
Not too many people.
I mean, what a fantastic cliffhanger to end the first act on. It's another moment where you realize that Peter Jackson isn't just showing clips cobbled together chronologically, he's crafting the story of this turbulent time of the world's most famous band. Then the beginning of part 2 is easily the toughest point of the documentary. The meeting with George didn't go well, and now John hasn't shown up either. This leads to questions from Michael Lindsay Hogg directed at Paul, asking him if John and Paul wrote more together before Yoko came along, and he says of course. But Paul says that's also because John and him were always around each other, touring, living together, and now John wants to be with his new love, and that's okay. Paul says,
She's great. She really is all right. They just want to be near each other.
Paul even alludes to the myth of Yoko breaking up the Beatles with the line,
But it's going to be such an incredible comical thing, like in 50 years' time, They broke up because Yoko sat on an M.
I'm just going to use this moment here to say that Get Back is just further evidence that Yoko didn't break up the Beatles. From my view, it really doesn't appear that Yoko is in any way disruptive. And look, I'm not an idiot. I realize that Peter Jackson could have edited out more moments of friction between her and the other Beatles. But from what I saw, she's more a silent support for John, who doesn't seem like he'd be able to handle those sessions without her. I mean, she's just like usually reading the paper or just quietly listening. She really just starts to become part of the scenery after a while. In one sequence later on, she's just doing like calligraphy off to the side. My girlfriend said it's almost like they're just in her living room while she goes about her business. But without a doubt, the most heartbreaking moment of the entire documentary that Paul and Ringo didn't even realize was being filmed is after they're not able to get onto John, and there's this 22-second long shot of Paul on the verge of tears after saying,
And then there were two.
he's coming to grips with so many things, that this album and TV special probably won't happen, that George and now John may be out of the group, which means he's not only losing the Beatles, he's losing his best friends. And sadly, it's also hauntingly prophetic. Apparently the audio of this has been circulating around on bootlegs for years, but it's an entirely other thing to see Paul actually processing this. It's just one of those moments that almost doesn't feel real. I mean, yeah, it absolutely broke me. And I'd love to know, to just share the weight of this scene. What did you think of this? Leave a comment. I'd love to hear your thoughts. But then we're given a little bit of hope when we hear that John is in fact coming in. What is then equally illuminating is the part where John and Paul go to the cafeteria for a private conversation. Little do they know that the filmmakers have hidden a microphone in a flower pot. Now this is truly remarkable, ethics aside, to hear a full conversation between John and Paul. To really be able to listen in and hear how they converse to each other when they think it's just the two of them is a revelation in itself. John seems to hit the nail on the head regarding George when he says,
It's a pestering wound, and yesterday we allowed it to go even deeper, but we didn't give him any time, did you? And when he is that far in, we had ego.
Then there's that revealing admission from Paul to John.
We've always been boss. I've been since second boss.
I mean, it's what we've always kind of thought the dynamic to be, but to actually just hear them say that to each other, wow. And then a truly bittersweet moment is when Paul says,
I think we're all very old. We're all reading each other. I think we're all singing together.
That also made me a little bit teary, I'm not gonna lie. And even though George is gone, there's still this great footage of John and Paul working together, like the writing partners they are, as they fine-tune the lyrics to Get Back. It's just one of the many examples in this documentary of the two of them still collaborating despite the common consensus up to now that they stopped writing together after Sgt. Pepper.
Looking for a blast from the past.
You even get the snippet of Paul playing a song he'd just come up with that morning, which turns out to be the earliest workings of The Backseat of My Car, off Paul's 1971 album Ram. Which really makes sense, as it's a song about leaving whatever's holding you back and escaping off with the person that you love, which was obviously a theme weighing on Paul's mind, as it's a similar sentiment as on The Long and Winding Road. However, after a few days of absence, the three Beatles have another meeting with George, this time a productive one, and all agree to unify, this time at Apple Studios. And in terms of the documentary, this marks the end of the bad blood between them all. In fact, I'll quote George, who said of the previous day's unfilmed rehearsal,
Good vibes, man.
what was then super cool to see is how George really stepped it up from here. He basically got the shit back up and running at Apple by supplying his own 8-track recorder, along with some gear from EMI courtesy of George Martin, after they found the mess of state-of-the-art equipment supplied by Magic Alex, which had been left in the studio for them but never ended up working properly. I'm really glad this documentary highlights how much of a bullshit artist Magic Alex was. It was just so great to see their spirits just fully pick up and even see them all laughing at that ridiculous article which stated that John and George came to blows, which was immediately debunked by the two of them in the funniest way. And I think this is where John really comes into his own in terms of humor. He seems to be less out of it like he was at Twickenham Studios. Nothing ever really seems to faze John Lennon. He really is just the most jovial and light-hearted of them all during this whole period. And now for Billy Preston. Oh man, Billy Preston. I've always heard how great of a presence Billy was for them all and how he really improved morale, but it's another thing to see exactly how he did it. The way Paul's face lights up when Billy comes in on I've Got a Feeling, he loves it. They all do.
You're in the groove. Electric piano is such a great sound.
And then there's that line from John.
You're giving us a lift, Bill.
And it's that compliment there that symbolizes exactly what Billy Preston does for the Beatles. And it's here that we get an improvised number between John, Paul, and Billy with Yoko wailing on vocals, and Paul looks like he's having a ball. Because you got to remember, Paul was one of the first of the Beatles to really get into the avant-garde scene. Maybe he didn't go as far with it, but he was one of the first. And to actually see him digging the sound that they were making only softens Yoko's influence even more. I love how excited John was to George when he arrives.
It was great. Yoko, John and Paul and Billy were doing their freak out.
He probably thought, great, my two collaborators finally coming together.
The whole place was zooming. I'd like it to be part of a new LP.
He's so adorable.
Because they're all on film. Yeah. What a great bit of film.
We then get another phase in the evolution of the song Get Back, this time with George interpolating the melody of Reach Out, I'll Be There into the song. Which is a mashup that needs to happen. Someone go and make that. A lovely discovery was the scene where they're considering making Billy Preston part of the Beatles.
I mean, I'd just like him in our band, actually. I like a fifth Beatles.
I knew about this fact before Get Back, but to see John actually push for the idea and then have George agree and say, hey, while we're all here, let's get them all in. Let's get in Bob Dylan. He'll definitely say yes.
You know, I asked Dylan to join the Beatles, and he would as well, you know, and we get them all in it.
Which, side note, is a really adorable running theme of George Harrison crushing hard on Bob Dylan throughout this entire process. He's singing his songs in his downtime and he's convinced that Dylan would want to join in. I don't know if he would, George. But I think it's very sweet that you want him part of the group. And of course, a few years down the track, George eventually got his wish and was in a group with Bob Dylan. Paul then brings everyone back down to earth by saying that there's enough trouble with Paul, which gets a pretty big laugh from everyone. Oh man, I also thought the conversation about their trip to India was incredibly illuminating. They all seem to have different takes on what the purpose was of them going there. Paul's pushing his artsiness and talking about the home movie they shot, plus all those knowing looks between John and Paul when discussing how they weren't really themselves in the presence of the Maharishi. I imagine this probably got on George's nerves quite a bit, especially when he says the thing that reminds everyone why he was often called the mystical one. That is the biggest joke, to be yourselves, because that was the purpose of going there, to try to find who yourself really is.
And if you were really yourself, you wouldn't be any of who we are now.
It really is mind-blowing just how very wise and spiritual George Harrison was even at just 25 years of age. For anyone writing a future Beatles biopic, pay attention to this scene. It's one of those moments that shows not just how much depth there was to George Harrison, but also shows how the real-life conversations of the Beatles are more insightful and poignant than any written script could ever be. Because yeah, you remember, all these guys, they're so young. George is 25, Paul's 26, John and Ringo are like barely 28 years old. The fact that all the Beatles, everything in the Beatles happened before any of them turned 30 is just... I love discovering how they all seem to enjoy playing older songs from different Beatles. You've got Paul singing Strawberry Fields Forever. And one that really surprised me was John knowing all the words to I Lost My Little Girl, the first song Paul ever wrote.
I lost my little girl, yes I had, that very last year.
And not one they ever recorded. It was just very sweet to me. Speaking of sweet, George helping out on Octopus's Garden. Bless him that he didn't feel the need to have a shared writing credit, because it definitely appears that he helped Ringo with the chord progression.
So it resolves itself.
You get a little bit of this sequence in Let It Be, but it's way more fleshed out in Get Back, and it's probably the most wholesome moment in the entire documentary. Finally, justice for George and Ringo. And then about 31 minutes in, there's another great example where John and Paul are writing together during Don't Let Me Down. I mean, you could use this screenshot of them at the piano as a symbol of their writing partnership. My final discovery, and one that left me feeling all kinds of bittersweet, was when Paul was out of the room and George was opening up to John about how he's got so many songs that he's got his quota for like the next 10 years, 10 albums, and that
I'd just like to maybe do an album of songs.
Of you on your own?
Yeah.
John thinks this is a great idea.
But that way, it also preserves the Beatle bit of it more.
Which is a pretty obvious hint that George and John intend the Beatles to continue. That this is a way of maintaining the band.
Now, Paul didn't hear that conversation. He sees the film and I ask him, what do you think about that conversation? That sort of paints a picture of how the Beatles could have carried on in the future. And you know what Paul said to me? He said, I wish I knew that they said that at the time.
Man, that set my mind and my heart racing. What if they discussed this again with Paul? What if they had a meeting where they could have been honest about this and agree to allow each other to do solo work, but still come back every now and then to do a Beatles album or even a show? It's too painful and pointless to deal in what ifs, but yeah, if that also had an effect on you, let me know in the comments. I do love how George considers giving his songs away, but ultimately decides,
Yeah, fuck all that. Just gonna do me for a bit.
So those are what I think are the big discoveries, the revelations of Get Back. Now, if you wouldn't mind, I'd like to fire off my list of the absolute greatest moments from the documentary, because there are a ton. These are pretty much all the moments that just made me smile and cheer like a big dumb idiot. Okay, working on I've Got a Feeling for the first time, and we get that brilliant moment of George's dry wit.
Is that one called I've Got a Feeling?
The clothes, oh my god, the clothes. From George's pink turtleneck to George and Ringo's frilly shirts. I also like how they seem to coordinate color palettes. There's entire days where some of them wear like entirely green hues or orange hues. Speaking of coordinating, Ringo and Heather, how they do entire takes of their songs in just the silliest of voices.
Never needed anybody's help in minute.
There's the one where they're doing Two of Us with entirely gritted teeth. Maybe this is the secret to their creativity. In fact, most takes that we see of them seem to just be them having a laugh. To the point where if you showed up for a few minutes, you'd probably think, these guys have lost it. They're not taking it seriously at all. But they still managed to write, rehearse, and record an entire album's worth of songs in less than a month. I guess because they're the Beatles and that's their power. George trolling one of the engineers with the mic that gives electric shocks. Mal Evans' delight in playing the anvil is just so charming. In fact, Mal is the unsung hero of the whole thing. The gentle giant who's always there with a lyric sheet or a cup of tea. George's priceless guitar just falling over it and not being a big deal. Seeing Linda Eastman back in 1969 before they were married, and Paul showing off in front of her on the piano and giving us a taste of his very first solo single, Another Day.
It's just another day.
The moment where Linda says,
Love to find a farm.
I mean, Paul must have been listening because that's exactly what he does for her. Oh, one of my favorite Blink and You'll Miss It shots is of Linda just timidly touching the keys on the organ during a rehearsal. A sign of things to come. A sign of wings to come. Sorry. A really sweet moment, Yoko and Linda just whispering to each other during rehearsals. Love that.
Did you ever see The Wizard of Oz?
No, I didn't, but I...
Paul, what are you doing? Why haven't you seen The Wizard of Oz? Also, why are you climbing up that chain? Man, all that... This was so silly. All they ever eat is toast and marmalade. They're like fucking Paddington Bear. Like, that's literally all they seem to consume the entire time.
There's just a lot of toast eating. I said to Stella McCartney a while back, I said, we were at a fancy dress party, I was trying to fit into one of his suits. I said, I have no idea. And she just goes, it's called malnutrition, darling.
I loved John's salute to Elvis on Elvis's birthday.
34. God bless our gracious king.
The fact that Paul keeps the set list of the Beatles' 1966 tour in his Hofner still tells you everything you need to know about Paul's love of performing live. This is like the 60s artist equivalent of keeping a festival wristband on months after it's over. Loved Paul gathering around the piano and just teaching what he knows. He always said if he wasn't a musician, he'd be a teacher, so I thought that was nice. Paul telling John off after John overshares his latest night of watching films and getting stoned.
I was sort of stoned and high and watching films.
Is there any need to do this in public, Mr. Lemon?
Honestly, very curious to hear more about that, but it made sense why it wasn't in the documentary. Getting to hear from a pair of real-life apple scruffs. Why are you here?
Just want to see him, that's fine.
One of them really is only there for Paul anyway, and Paul happens to be, out of all the Beatles, the only one to acknowledge their presence. And it's not overstated, it's just a small smile and an eyebrow raise, but he really recognizes the importance of those girls. That dumb friggin' guitar bass creation from Magic Alex, that shot of John and Ringo arm in arm. I also loved watching the Beatles listening back to their own music that they've just recorded, especially when they close their eyes and just go to another place. John expressing his love for Fleetwood Mac.
Did you see Fleetwood Mac on Late Night Live?
So sweet. And the lead singer's great.
Paul for Canned Heat.
That's that Canned Heat one. I love that one.
John passionately discussing Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech.
He would have been president, you know.
I love hearing them talk about the novelty of stereo and like the panning of the drums. It's always nice to hear Paul perform 20 Flight Rock, the song that got him into the Quarrymen. I also love Paul going back to his Hofner. George is like, where's your Rickenbacker? Paul's like, I like this one, it's lighter. I love when the four of them were just reminiscing about their days of playing live. I really got into Paul making like a story or like a concept album out of the songs.
It's like have to get back. We're on our way home. But it's a story.
He really is the biggest Beatles fan of them all. Oh man, this is so very revealing. The bit where John and Paul are putting two of us together and we get this exchange.
It's like you and me are lovers.
Yeah.
Just perfect. Can't be the only one who's a huge fan of the song Fancy Me Chances. Oh, hearing Bye Bye Love sung by Lennon McCartney? Wow, can we have that studio version, please? That was an absolute treat. Paul doing parkour on the rooftop. I love seeing how good Paul is with Heather. It's a glimpse of the family man he's about to become. In fact, with the exception of George, from what we've seen, all the Beatles in this series show how good they are with kids, how natural. I know this is a popular one, but Heather just staring at Yoko while she just wails into the mic. Priceless. But then minutes later we see Heather doing the same thing because she doesn't know that that's not really what you're meant to do on a microphone. And then I love John noticing it and calling Yoko's name. Yoko! Hey, you get to see George having a few fun, silly moments as well. You've got that bit where he's like warbling with the microphone on his neck. Heather combing Paul's hair was really adorable. John and Paul dancing together. So much love and affection. Such a contrast to the previous week at Twickenham. Also, it's just incredible how normal all of them appear as well. None of them seem out of touch or obnoxious. In fact, all the business scenes with all the men in suits and other out there characters just make you see how regular and down to earth all the Beatles actually were. And also how cool they all were in their own way. You really notice this once they've left and all the film crew pick up the instruments and start playing and just look like the biggest bunch of stiffs. Ringo giving Yoko a stick of gum, who then breaks it in half and gives it to John. Wholesome, wholesome, wholesome. Okay, now finally I'm going to talk about the rooftop performance. I love how quiet it all was, and then just bam! Get Back starts and we're on a whole other level. It's like our ears have been tuned to the smaller studio sound and now we're getting the full blast. Paul's face as he gives that big cheer during John's first guitar solo. He can't believe he's back playing live with the boys. He's ecstatic. I loved how this performance was edited. Several clips on screen at once, but all from the same time. You get to see the rooftop, the street, and the producers all at once. And I thought it was just a really effective way to show the scope of the event. This is most effective when contrasting the clip of the cops downstairs complaining with easily the coolest thing in the world happening at that moment just a few floors up. The main cop, or the bobbies in the lobby, as I call them, he looks barely older than 24, which only makes it more hilarious. The way they all smile at each other during the gig is just wonderful. The joy on John's face, especially during Dig a Pony, is just fantastic. He'd been doping himself on heroin during this period, but nothing's given him a high quite like making music like this and playing it live once again. Easily one of my favorite moments is this one. He starts taunting them with his salacious dance moves. He really couldn't have asked for anything better. You know he'd just love to get arrested for playing rock and roll with his best mates. His bass work at the end of Don't Let Me Down. Then the incredibly cinematic moment in the last Get Back where George and John's amps get turned off. George just wheels around, turns his back on, Mal has to give in, turns John's back on, and they can finish the song. Meanwhile, Paul's realizing that this may be the last time that they play live in a while, maybe ever, and is making this count. And then just all of them listening to it afterwards, that great shot of their feet tapping away, plus George bobbing his head with his eyes closed. You can see on their face that they think they've made some really good stuff. Yeah. Okay, my final thoughts. I think we've all come to believe to some degree that the final year in the Beatles' lifespan was a deeply unhappy, unproductive time for them all. And although there were obvious low points and friction here and there, I don't believe that any band who had the kind of success that the Beatles had was free of these kind of low moments in their careers either. It was just so magnified because of the sheer stature of the Beatles. And I truly think that the original Let It Be film mythologized this bad blood narrative to the point where we all kind of accepted that that's who they were by the end.
Seems like there's a rift happening between the Beatles.
But the Beatles Get Back takes that narrative and turns it on its head. History has in a way been rewritten, or more appropriately, been corrected. Not only do we get insights into the Beatles' creative process, we get to see them as human beings. We form a greater understanding of who these guys were and what they meant to each other. To end with the complete rooftop performance is such a delightful payoff. And of course the entire performance looks and sounds incredible. Peter Jackson crafted a truly compelling story out of 56 hours of footage, and I think this series will be held up as the preeminent Beatles film. I think it's not only the best Beatles film, better than A Hard Day's Night or Help, and definitely better than any biopic, but I also think it's my favorite documentary about a rock and roll band, of which there are many. And just like how in 1964 we welcomed the Beatles inside our homes for the first time, now 57 years later, we're welcoming them inside again. But this time as old friends who we can just hang out with and have a laugh, and all the while marvel at their charisma, their talent, and most of all, their unlimited musical genius. As Peter Jackson told Rolling Stone, "There's a joy in the songs that they sang. In decades and decades to come, it will never be dulled. It will never be suppressed. That joy, that infectious joy, is part of the human psyche now." It has never been a better time to be a fan of the Beatles. Hey everyone, thanks for watching this video to the end, I really appreciate it. Now I'd love to know what you thought of the Beatles Get Back. Jump down in the comments and let me know your favourite moments from the documentary. Were you disappointed? Were you delighted? Did something surprise you? And if you enjoyed this video, please give it a like, and if you haven't already, hit subscribe. I make a lot of Beatles content and would love to share it with you. And like I said earlier in the video, if you'd like to support me on Patreon, I would really appreciate it. It'd mean I can make these videos more often, and it also means you'll get access to bonus content. I usually make 1 or 2 extra videos a month as well, plus other bonus content, and you'll get a say in what kind of content I make in future. So link in the description if you'd like to support me. Otherwise, thank you so much for watching, and as usual, I'll see you in the next one.
Good night, Paul.
Say good night, John.
Good night, Paul.
Good night.